Welcome back. Let's begin today's class with sharing with you the background of Rabbi Naftali Astulin. Rabbi Naftali Astulin is a Chabad rabbi for the Russian Jewish community in Los Angeles, and who has been there for many years. And he was born right after World War II, and he shares that his, living, as many people know, in Russia, under communist Russia, or the former USSR, to be accurate, at that time, everything and anything that was done that was Jewish had to be done in complete secrecy. And he was born to a Chabad Hasidic family. Everything they did, Jewish, that they did was a complete secret. Even their Jewishness, they never openly admitted to or revealed in a way of observance. And in 1958, his grandparents were able to emigrate. And in 1968, finally, his parents and his family were able to leave Russia. When they moved to Israel, he came to New York to study, and his parents came to New York to have a yechidus, which we call it a private audience with the Rebbe, which he joined his parents for as well. And he recounts how his mother broke down crying, and the mother broke down crying and said, "What's going to be with my sister and my brother-in-law who are still in Russia? They are never going to be permitted to leave because my brother-in-law sat for 8 years in prison for disseminating Torah and mitzvahs. And someone with that background, the KGB, will never let him leave." So the Rebbe looked at her and said, "How did you get out of Russia? The KGB would never let someone like your family out of Russia as well. Clearly, it was God who took you out of Russia in a miraculous fashion. And while it's true that your sister may need a greater miracle than you needed, but when God performs miracles, does it really make any difference to God whether it's a bigger miracle or a smaller miracle? It really makes no difference at all. They just need a miracle like you to get out." And in fact, 6 months later, her sister, Rabbi Astulin's aunt and uncle, came out of Russia. Again, reminding us that we are not beholden to anything other than the will of God. And in some respect, that was a blessing, a couched blessing that the Rebbe had given them in that meeting, saying that you came out and they're also going to come out. But remember that your coming out was miraculous. And miracles are, the size of miracles are completely irrelevant when we are realizing that we are talking about an infinite God. So we continue our conversation today in chapter 4. We are discussing the 7 areas of one's life in which one needs to have trust and how to have trust in each of those areas. And we're discussing the area of life, the third area of our dependents, our family members, acquaintances, people who we have interactions with, whether they be beloved people or our enemies. And now we are going to further discuss how one should have trust in God in the context of relationship with enemies, people who have hurt us. And we continue. In matters relating to his enemies and those who are envious of him and who seek his harm, he should trust in the Creator. What is going to protect you from people who seek your harm? The Creator. Because again, from the Creator may he be exalted and bear their scorn. And in other words, bear their scorn means just accept the fact that they may scorn you and they may accuse you and they may say ugly things to you or about you, and just swallow that, because ultimately we trust in Hashem. What is the point again? The point again is that an enemy can do nothing to you unless God wants that thing to happen to you. So our trust goes entirely in God, because the power is not in our enemy. The power is in God. A person should not pay his enemies back in kind with hurtful and hateful things, but with kindness. This is a very powerful point. And this may sound naive. It's not naive at all. It is the most powerful response to people who are detrimental or negative. And any favor that he can do for them, he should do, bearing in mind that his well-being and injury are in the hands of the Creator. May he be exalted. In fact, the Alter Rebbe teaches us in Tanya very powerfully, in addition to what we learned about Joseph in prison, and that he paid his brothers very hateful behavior to him with kindness. That's what Joseph did. He paid back his brothers with kindness, even though they almost killed him, and last minute they decided, no, we won't kill you, we'll sell you into slavery, which is one of the harshest things you can do to a human being. And yet he paid them back entirely with kindness. So the Alter Rebbe tells us that even those who the Talmud tells us we are obligated to hate, but still, because we rebuke them and they have still not repented, one is still obligated to love them at the same time. Well, how can you hate someone and love someone at the same time? And the Alter Rebbe explains that the hate is only hate towards the aspects of them which are negative. But then there is the very essence of the person and the many aspects of the person which are positive, and that part of the person we are not meant to hate at all. So when we say to love and hate someone at the same time, we're talking about different parts of the person, and we have to realize that we as people are very complex, and there are different parts to us, and there are parts of us which are negative, and there are parts of us which are positive. If his enemies should cause him injury, if in fact they end up causing him injury, he should judge them favorably. Then a person we are meant to judge that person favorably, and suspect himself and his deeds of having been previously evil in God's sight. How could such a negative thing befall me? Not because my enemy has power over me, but because I must have done wrong, and therefore this is some form of a cleansing of my soul. So therefore God brought suffering upon me, and it happened to have come through this particular enemy. Had I not needed that cleansing, or had I not needed that experience it could have been another reason. For some reason I had to go through this experience because it's going to reveal within me something that otherwise wouldn't be revealed. Whatever the reason may be, because there are many, many reasons why something negative why we experience negative things. The one of the many of which is maybe a wrongdoing that I've done. That's why God brought it upon me. But had there been nothing good about this for me, the enemy would never have been able to do this to me. And I want to reiterate again, because it's the obvious question everyone always asks. And that is, of course, we should not make ourselves vulnerable to an enemy and open ourselves up to their ability to hurt us. That's negligence, which negligence is an absolute wrong from Torah standards. But it means that while we maintain a safe position for ourselves, we still can interact with that other person with kindness, because that actually will rehabilitate them. And the most powerful emotional state that a person can possibly be in is an emotional state where not only are my emotions not affected by anything you do to me, but on the contrary, because I'm not affected, I remain clear, and I can still give you kindness in the face of ugliness that you have given me in the past, which will enable you to rehabilitate much more likely than if I am just nasty back to you. So he should plead before God. What should the person do who suffers by the hands of an enemy? He should plead before God and ask him to forgive his sins. Then his enemies will become his friends. As the wise man said, as King Solomon, who's referred to as the wise man, says, when God is pleased with man's ways, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. God turns your enemies into your friends. Now we're going to discuss another area in life, and the other area in life is our responsibility as a Jew who's been given a divine responsibility in this world to live a certain way, to conduct ourselves a certain way, and to observe the commandments of God, which illuminate the world with goodness and divinity. So let us now, and this is the fourth group or fourth area of life that we need to know how to demonstrate trust in God. So let us now take up the fourth group. And this is the duties of the heart and limbs. The duties of our heart, of how we feel, and our limbs, and action that affect oneself alone, for benefit or for harm, such as fasting and prayer, sukkah, lulav and tzitzis, observing Shabbos and the festivals, avoiding sins, and all the duties of the heart that affect no one else but whose benefit or harm is limited to oneself to the exclusion of all others. We have an area of life which are our spiritual responsibilities. And in that area, that affects ultimately us, because it's our personal relationship with God, and whether we choose to fulfill them or to stay away from the things we're not supposed to be interacting with, or vice, all of that, or whether we fulfill them or don't fulfill them, all of that actually is going to affect us more than it's going to affect anything else. And in fact, the name of the book within which we have a section called The Gate of Trust is called Chovas Halavavos, which means duties of the heart, which means duties of the heart, of the soul, our spiritual responsibility in this world. Now, I just want to point out something which I find to be very meaningful and beautiful, and that is that when God gives us commandments, we call them mitzvahs. A mitzvah literally is translated as a commandment. More spiritually, the word mitzvah comes from an Aramaic, is associated with an Aramaic word, which was tzavta, which means to connect. And when we understand the deeper significance of a mitzvah, when we talk about a commandment, it's like when someone commands me to do something, immediately our ego comes up, like, oh, don't tell me what to do, right? We don't like commandments. At the same time, when we understand that a mitzvah is a connection that bonds us with God, which is the meaning of tzavta, which means that tzavta is to bond with God, that connects us deeply with God, that's something that's much more meaningful. And the reality is this, that while God gives us many commandments, mitzvahs, and we understand much of the commandments, and many of the commandments we understand and they make sense, and we enjoy or appreciate their value, but at the essence of every single mitzvah is the fact that it is not just something that is understood, but it is the will of God. It is the ratzon, the will of God. Why I am emphasizing this is because when we are in a relationship and we engage with the other person from our conscious level, if you will, or from our will, our level of comprehension, that is a limited, it could be somewhat profound, but still limited relationship. As long as I understand you, and as long as my mind tells me that it makes sense to be in a relationship with you, I'm in a relationship with you. When the deepest connection we have with another person is when we connect with their will. I understand what you will, even though that may not make any sense to me. But I understand what you will, and I connect with you on that deep level, because the will of a person is deeper than their intellect. It is something that comes from their deeper, from almost their essential state, that they want something, that they will something, which is why sometimes we want things that we can't explain. We don't. You ask me, why do you want that, right? Why we want certain things. Sometimes it defies explanation. I know. I just have this deep inner craving for it. And very often that comes from a deeper place than something that we can explain, which is why we can't explain it. When we connect with someone on that level, it's very profound. If we connect, for example, with a spouse on that level of what they want is something that I want because they want it, in other words, I want to give it to them, they feel very deep, they feel so deeply attached to us because we're willing to connect on that deep level. And that is what our duties in this world are, an opportunity to connect very profoundly and deeply with God. So the proper way of relying on God, may He be exalted, in all these matters, in all of these religious, if you will, matters, is as I shall explain. And he adds, interestingly, that I ask of God that in His mercy He teach me the truth. That he's asking for God for guidance, that what he's going to say now is aligned correctly. And he breaks this down very interestingly and it makes it very helpful. He says like this. He says that there is a level of trust and free choice that we have when it comes to serving God in our spiritual life that we don't have when it comes to serving God in our physical or material life. So human actions that constitute either service of God or transgression when it comes to human actions, our activities which are spiritual, which relate to the service of God or negating, going against the will of God, can take place only if three factors are present. There need to be three factors. Factor number one is choice by the heart and mind. Your mind and your heart need to choose to do this, right? So your mind needs to understand that this is the right thing for you to do, and so much so that your thought affects you emotionally, and your emotions get excited about this, about doing this because it's the right thing to do. And just and just tangentially, it's worth pointing out that very often there is a blockage between the mind and the heart. Sometimes we understand something, but we don't feel it, which is a challenge in and of itself. And he mentions here the mind and the heart, because both of them are very important in someone being truly motivated. Of course, we can do things that we understand even though we don't feel it, because we override our feelings. But it's even more effective when we have our mind and our heart engaged. That's number one. That we can choose. And how do we choose to get our heart and mind engaged? By studying and by learning about the significance of things. Number two, intent and resolve to do what one has chosen. Intent and resolve to do. That it's not enough to understand and to feel about doing something, but you also have to have resolve that I'm going to do everything I can to get this done. And number three, the effort to complete the intended act with one's outer limbs and bring it into actuality. It's not enough to understand it. It's not enough to just resolve to do it. One has to take themselves physically and do it. These are the three steps. And he's breaking them down for a reason, because he wants to show us where we have choice and where we're supposed to trust. That's the key here. We only trust God in areas that God didn't give us choice. Where God gave us choice, we don't trust God. God says, I told you what to do. Do it and then trust me for the results. So in regard to what is not hidden or removed from us, such as the choice of service or transgression. So the first points, he says the first two of the 3 points, the point of choosing to understand and feel about of serving God, and the intent and resolve to carry out what one has chosen, relying on God in these would be erroneous and foolish, because that's in our hands. God gave us free choice to think, to feel, and to resolve to do something. That's all within us. So to trust in God for that would be relinquishing our responsibility. For the Creator, may He be exalted, has left to us the choice of serving Him or rebelling against Him. As it's written in the book of Deuteronomy, Uvacharta b'chaim, choose life. That God commands us to choose life. And in fact, we find it very interestingly that when Yosef, who became the viceroy of Egypt, and he finally meets he has one brother who's his complete brother, not a half brother. All of the other tribes, the 10 of the other tribes are all half brothers. They share their father Jacob, but they have different mothers. The one brother he had that was both from his father Jacob and his mother Rachel was Benjamin. When they finally reunite after the many years that he was in slavery and then viceroy in Egypt, it says that he hugged his brother hugged him, and they both cried on each other's shoulders. And we're taught that they cried for events that were going to happen in each other's portion of Israel that each tribe got. So Yosef cried for what was going to happen in Binyamin's portion of Israel, which included the temple, Jerusalem, where the temple was built, where both temples were destroyed. So Joseph cried because he was able to foresee with prophecy that his brother Binyamin would have these losses in his area of Israel. And the temporary tabernacle that they traveled with until the temple was built, which sat in a city called Shiloh for 369 years, which was the area of Joseph, that was destroyed at one point in history. And Binyamin cried, when he hugged his brother Yosef, he cried for Yosef. So they each cried for each other's losses. But the question is, why didn't they cry for their own losses? Why did they only cry for each other's losses? And the reason, and the very profound lesson we learn from this is that when someone else has a loss, you have compassion for them. Why? You can't control their life. You can't determine what they should do about their situation. What you can do is show care. By having compassion, you cry for them. But when it comes to your own loss, you don't cry. You have choice. You do something about it. So this is what we learn here. When it comes to choosing, right? in areas that we have choice, that God gave us choice of to choose, to think and to feel and to resolve, that we can't do. Emotions are very nice, but we have to actually do it. So trusting in God is just misplaced in such a situation. However, but the carrying out of the intended act of service or transgression, what about the actual now, the third step that he said, of actually taking our limbs and bringing our understanding, our feelings, and our resolve into actuality? That he did not leave to us, but made it dependent on external means that are sometimes present and at other times unavailable. What happens when a person finds themselves in a situation that they're in they're deserted, that they find themselves stuck somewhere for the holiday of Sukkot, and there's no lulav and esrog available, and it's impossible for him to get a lulav and esrog. He cannot fulfill the mitzvah. Why can't he fulfill the mitzvah? He has the desire to. He feels very strongly to fulfill it. And he resolved that he will. And he did everything possible in his means to get a lulav and esrog, but he couldn't. That's because that ultimately is in God's hands, whether we'll be able to actually fulfill the mitzvah in actuality. So there we need to trust in God that God will give us our means to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. So this is the point he's saying of where do you trust in God when it comes to your spiritual life. If a person relies on God in the very choice of serving him, and says, I will neither choose nor resolve to do anything in the service of the Creator until he chooses for me what is best, he strays from the straight path and deviates from the right way. God already told us what he wants us to do. So there's no trust required that I need to trust God for God to show me what to do. God's instructed us very clearly in the Torah on what to do. We have to do everything we can to do that. If God sets up circumstances where it's not possible for us to do that, okay, as we discussed a number of times, we are in the efforts department, God is in the results department. There's nothing we can do about that. So in that area, if we see that we're having trouble actually fulfilling the mitzvah, then we trust in God that God will provide us with what we need in order to be able to actually fulfill the mitzvah physically. For the Creator, may he be exalted, has already commanded us to choose the performance of his service and to direct our intent toward it with vigor and resolve and a whole heart for the sake of his great name. And he has instructed us that this is the right way for us in this world and the next. If the means are available to us, and we are able to carry out the work of service which we had previously chosen through understanding, feeling, and resolve, we will receive abundant reward for having chosen God's service, for having intended to discharge it, and for having carried out its acts with our external limbs. And if our limbs are unable to carry out the acts, because the circumstances are such that our limbs can't do it because something is not available, we will receive reward for having chosen and intended to do them. As we mentioned earlier, we learned earlier that a machshava tova, a good thought, a positive thought to do the proper thing, that a person ultimately, he had the thought to do, but he couldn't ultimately do it practically because it wasn't available to him. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzvah l'maisa, God considers it as if he actually did it. And the same is true in regard to punishment for transgression. And likewise, when it comes to transgression, that if a person intends to do a transgression, and they actually do it, then they will get punished for the transgression and for the intention of the transgression. If a person intends to do a transgression but doesn't actually do it, they don't get punished for their intention, even though they were planning on doing it, but they couldn't. They don't get punished for that. But if they intended and they did it, they get punished for both doing it and for the intention of doing it. So now we understand where we're supposed to place our trust when it comes to our spiritual service of God. And now he discusses the difference between the service of the Creator and secular activities. He draws a comparison so we can see this more clearly of how we trust in God when it comes to spiritual service, and versus trusting in God when it comes to our secular activities, making a living and all of our needs that we have as physical human beings. So the difference between the service of the Creator and secular activities in regard to trust in God, may he be exalted, is as follows. In secular affairs, it has not been revealed to us which means are better or worse than other means, or which are harmful or not harmful. For we do not know which profession is best for us and more worthwhile for securing a livelihood, preserving health, and for our general well-being. Nor do we know which business venture, journey, or other worldly pursuit will succeed when we try them. When it comes to our spiritual life, God gives us precise instructions on things that we should do. But when it comes to our secular life, for example, profession, God doesn't tell us that you should do this profession, you should do that profession. God left it wide open. So it's not clear to us as it is in the spiritual. That's why in the spiritual, we don't need to trust in God. God told us exactly what to do. When it comes to our material life and our physical life, we need much more trust in God, because many more aspects of it have not been spelled out and defined to us. To some extent, God limited that we're not allowed to do certain things, but there's a vast world of possibilities where we can choose how to make a living and how to take care of our health, and etc., etc. So it therefore follows that both in making a choice and implementing it, we must trust in God that He will help us attain what is for our good. We have to trust in God that the choice we're making of the avenue we are going to take for a livelihood is an avenue that God will bless, and that when we actually, make the effort after we study for many years and we open up this business, that God will bless the business. We must apply ourselves diligently to our work. We have to do what we have to do, which is to be able to create a source of income, and beseech Him and beseech God to stir our hearts to choose what is good and proper for us. And we also trust in God that God is going to assist us in doing what is properly aligned for who we are and who God designed us to be. As we learned earlier, you choose an occupation that's aligned with you. It could take us many years to know ourselves better, more deeply, and deeply enough to be able to choose the proper thing. But the service of the Creator is different. For when it comes to our spiritual service, for God has already informed us of the right course to take. He commanded us to choose it, and given us the ability to do so. To choose it. God has given us the ability to choose it and desire to do it. If then we pray to God in respect to the choice we should make, and trust in Him to show us what is good for us, we will err in our words of supplication and be foolish in our trust, since He has already made known to us the ways of His service that will benefit us in this world and the next. If we're going to pray to God to show us what choice to make in regards to whether I should be doing this or not, God says, I already commanded you to do it. You don't need to pray to me. That would be foolish. As it says, God commanded us to observe all these statutes, to revere Hashem, our God, for our own good always. And this is for our own good. And in regard to reward in the world to come, it says it will be to our credit if we are careful to observe. Also in secular matters, commendable means may be reprehensible. When it comes to worldly affairs, which refers to our secular matters, sometimes something which seems commendable, it seems like a great thing, and your friend tells you this is a great idea, but it can be reprehensible, ends up being something which backfires on us and doesn't work out well at all. And those that are reprehensible may become commendable. Sometimes we take up a bad business option, and our friends tell us you're crazy and this can't work. And somehow, because God chooses to bless us through it, we find tremendous blessing through it. But when it comes to our spiritual life, that will never be the case. God tells us clearly, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. And what you should do, it will never turn out to be something that is bad for you. And what you shouldn't do, it will never turn out to be something that's good for you. This is not so, however, with the service of God or transgression of His commands. In these, that which is reprehensible or commendable remains so and never changes. We can have utmost confidence when it comes to serving God in our spiritual lives to know exactly what to do. We only need to turn to the Torah and abide by the Torah's decrees. I look forward to seeing you for our next class.